Chapter 2, Part 2 of The Doctor, His Wife and the Clock by Ann Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Carolyn. Chapter 2, Part 2. Side by side with these lines, I, Ebenezer Gryce, placed the following extracts from my own diary. Watched the Zabriskie mansion for 5 hours this morning from the second-story window of an adjoining hotel. Saw the doctor when he drove away on his round of visits, and saw him when he returned. A colored man accompanied him. Today I followed Mrs. Zabriskie. I had a motive for this, the nature of which I think it wisest not to divulge. She went first to a house in Washington Place where I am told her mother lives. Here she stayed some time, after which she drove down to Canal Street, where she did some shopping, and later stopped at the hospital, into which I took the liberty of following her. She seemed to know many there, and passed from cot to cot with a smile in which I alone discerned the sadness of a broken heart. When she left, I left also, without having learned anything beyond the fact that Mrs. Zabriskie is one who does her duty in sorrow as in happiness. A rare and trustworthy woman, I should say, and yet her husband does not trust her. Why? I have spent this day in accumulating details in regard to Dr. and Mrs. Zabriskie's life previous to the death of Mr. Hasbrouck. I learned from sources it would be unwise to quote just here that Mrs. Zabriskie had not lacked enemies ready to charge her with coquetry, that while she had never sacrificed her dignity in public, more than one person had been heard to declare that Dr. Zabriskie was fortunate in being blind, since the sight of his wife's beauty would have but poorly compensated him for the pain he would have suffered in seeing how that beauty was admired. That all gossip is more or less tinged with exaggeration, I have no doubt, yet when a name is mentioned in connection with such stories, there is usually some truth at the bottom of them. And a name is mentioned in this case, though I do not think it worth my while to repeat it here, and loth as I am to recognize the fact, it is a name that carries with it doubts that might easily account for the husband's jealousy. True, I have found no one who dares to hint that she still continues to attract attention or to bestow smiles in any direction, save where they legally belong. For since a certain memorable night which we all know, neither Dr. Zabriskie nor his wife have been seen, save in their own domestic circle, and it is not into such scenes that this serpent, of which I have spoken, ever intrudes, nor is it in places of sorrow or suffering that his smile shines, or his fascinations flourish. And so, one portion of my theory is proved to be sound. Dr. Zabriskie is jealous of his wife, whether with good cause or bad I am not prepared to decide, for her present attitude, clouded as it is by the tragedy in which she and her husband are both involved, must differ very much from that which she held when her life was unshadowed by doubt and her admirers could be counted by the score. I have just found out where Harry is. As he is in service some miles up the river, I shall have to be absent from my post for several hours, but I consider the game well worth the candle. Light at last. I have seen Harry, and by means known only to the police, have succeeded in making him talk. His story is substantially this, that on the night so often mentioned, he packed his master's portmanteau at 8 o'clock, and at 10 called a carriage and rode with the doctor to the 29th Street station. He was told to buy tickets for Poughkeepsie, where his master had been called in consultation, and having done this, hurried back to join his master on the platform. They had walked together as far as the cars, and Dr. Zabriskie was just stepping onto the train when a man pushed himself hurriedly between them and whispered something into his master's ear, which caused him to fall back and lose his footing. Dr. Zabriskie's body slid half under the car, but he was withdrawn before any harm was done, though the cars gave a lurch at that moment, which must have frightened him exceedingly, for his face was white when he rose to his feet, and when Harry offered to assist him again onto the train, he refused to go and said he would return home and not attempt to ride to Poughkeepsie that night. The gentleman, whom Harry now saw to be Mr. Stanton, an intimate friend of Dr. Zabriskie, smiled very queerly at this, and taking the doctor's arm, led him away to a carriage. Harry naturally followed them, but the doctor, hearing his steps, turned and bade him, in a very peremptory tone, to take the omnibus home, and then, as if on second thought, told him to go to Poughkeepsie in his stead, and explain to the people there that he was too shaken up by his misstep to do his duty, and that he would be with them next morning. This seemed strange to Harry, but he had no reason for disobeying his master's orders, and so rode to Poughkeepsie. But the doctor did not follow him the next day. On the contrary, he telegraphed for him to return, and when he got back, dismissed him with a month's wages. This ended Harry's connection with the Zabriskie family. A simple story bearing out what the wife had already told us, but it furnishes a link which may prove invaluable. Mr. Stanton, whose first name is Theodore, knows the real reason why Dr. Zabriskie returned home on the night of the 17th of July, 1851. Mr. Stanton, consequently, I must see, and this shall be my business tomorrow. Checkmate. Theodore Stanton is not in this country, though this points him out as the man from whom Dr. Zabriskie bought the pistol. It does not facilitate my work, which is becoming more and more difficult. Mr. Stanton's whereabouts are not even known to his most intimate friends. He sailed from this country most unexpectedly on the 18th of July a year ago, which was the day after the murder of Mr. Hasbrouck. It looks like a flight, especially as he has failed to maintain open communication even with his relatives. Was he the man who shot Mr. Hasbrouck? No, but he was the man who put the pistol in Dr. Zabriskie's hand that night, and whether he did this with purpose or not, was evidently so alarmed at the catastrophe which followed that he took the first outgoing steamer to Europe. So far all is clear, but there are mysteries yet to be solved, which will require my utmost tact. What if I seek out the gentleman with whose name that of Mrs. Zabriskie has been linked, and see if I can in any way connect him with Mr. Stanton or the events of that night? Eureka! I have discovered that Mr. Stanton cherished a mortal hatred for the gentleman above mentioned. It was a covert feeling, but no less deadly on that account, and while it never led him into any extravagances, it was of force sufficient to account for many a secret misfortune which happened to that gentleman. Now, if I can prove he was the Mephistopheles who whispered insinuations into the ear of our blind Faust, I may strike a fact that will lead me out of this maze. But how can I approach secrets so delicate without compromising the woman I feel bound to respect, if only for the devoted love she manifests for her unhappy husband? I shall have to appeal to Joe Smithers. This is something which I always hate to do, but as long as he will take money, and as long as he is fertile in resources for obtaining the truth from people I am myself unable to reach, so long must I make use of his cupidity and his genius. He is an honorable fellow in one way, and never retails as gossip what he acquires for our use. How will he proceed in this case, and by what tactics will he gain the very delicate information which we need? I own that I am curious to see. I shall really have to put down at length the incidents of this night. I always knew that Joe Smithers was invaluable to the police, but I really did not know he possessed talents of so high an order. He wrote me this morning that he had succeeded in getting Mr. T's promise to spend the evening with him, and advised me that if I desired to be present also, his own servant would not be at home, and that an opener of bottles would be required. As I was very anxious to see Mr. T with my own eyes, I accepted the invitation to play the spy upon a spy, and went at the proper hour to Mr. Smithers's rooms, which are in the University building. I found them picturesque in the extreme. Piles of books stacked here and there to the ceiling made nooks and corners which could be quite shut off by a couple of old pictures that were set into movable frames that swung out or in at the whim or convenience of the owner. As I liked the dark shadows cast by these pictures, I pulled them both out and made such other arrangements as appeared likely to facilitate the purpose I had in view. Then I sat down and waited for the two gentlemen who were expected to come in together. They arrived almost immediately, whereupon I rose and played my part with all necessary discretion. While ridding Mr. T of his overcoat, I stole a look at his face. It is not a handsome one, but it boasts of a gay, devil-may-care expression, which doubtless makes it dangerous to many women, while his manners are especially attractive, and his voice the richest and most persuasive that I have ever heard. I contrasted him, almost against my will, with Dr. Zabriskie, and decided that with most women the former's undoubted fascinations of speech and bearing would outweigh the latter's great beauty and mental endowments, but I doubted if they would with her. The conversation which immediately began was brilliant but desultory, for Mr. Smithers, with an airy lightness for which he is remarkable, introduced topic after topic, perhaps for the purpose of showing off Mr. T's versatility, and perhaps for the deeper and more sinister purpose of shaking the kaleidoscope of talk so thoroughly that the real topic which we were met to discuss should not make an undue impression on the mind of his guest. Meanwhile 1, 2, 3 bottles passed, and I saw Joe Smithers's eye grow calmer, and that of Mr. T more brilliant and more uncertain. As the last bottle showed signs of failing, Joe cast me a meaning glance, and the real business of the evening began. I shall not attempt to relate the half-dozen failures which Joe made in endeavoring to elicit the facts we were in search of, without arousing the suspicion of his visitor. I am only going to relate the successful attempt. They had been talking now for some hours, and I, who had long before been waved from their immediate presence, was hiding my curiosity and growing excitement behind one of the pictures, when suddenly I heard Joe say, "He has the most remarkable memory I ever met. He can tell to a day when any notable event occurred." "Pshaw," answered his companion, who, by the by, was known to pride himself upon his own memory for dates. "I can state where I went and what I did on every day in the year. That may not embrace what you call notable events, but the memory required is all the more remarkable, is it not?" "Pooh," was his friend's provoking reply. "You are bluffing, Ben. I will never believe that." Mr. T, who had passed by this time into that state of intoxication which makes persistence in an assertion a duty as well as a pleasure, threw back his head, and as the wreaths of smoke rose in airy spirals from his lips, reiterated his statement and offered to submit to any test of his vaunted powers which the other might dictate. "You have a diary," began Joe. "Which is at home," completed the other. "Will you allow me to refer to it tomorrow if I am suspicious of the accuracy of your recollections?" "Undoubtedly," returned the other. "Very well, then, I will wager you a cool 50 that you cannot tell where you were between the hours of 10 and 11 on a certain night which I will name." "Done," cried the other, bringing out his pocket-book and laying it on the table before him. Joe followed his example and then summoned me. "Write a date down here," he commanded, pushing a piece of paper towards me, with a look keen as the flash of a blade. "Any date, man," he added, as I appeared to hesitate in the embarrassment I thought natural under the circumstances. "Put down day, month, and year, only don't go too far back, not farther than 2 years." Smiling with the air of a flunkey admitted to the sports of his superiors, I wrote a line and laid it before Mr. Smithers, who at once pushed it with a careless gesture towards his companion. You can of course guess the date I made use of. July 17th, 1851. Mr. T, who had evidently looked upon this matter as a mere play, flushed scarlet as he read these words, and for one instant looked as if he had rather flee our presence than answer Joe Smithers's nonchalant glance of inquiry. "I have given my word and I will keep it," he said at last, but with a look in my direction that sent me reluctantly back to my retreat. "I don't suppose you want names," he went on, "that is, if anything I have to tell is of a delicate nature." "Oh, no," answered the other, "only facts and places." "I don't think places are necessary either," he returned. "I will tell you what I did, and that must serve you. I did not promise to give number and street." "Well, well," Joe exclaimed, "earn your 50, that is all. Show that you remember where you were in the night of—" and with an admirable show of indifference, he pretended to consult the paper between them. "The 17th of July, 1851, and I shall be satisfied." "I was at the club for one thing," said Mr. T. "Then I went to see a lady friend, where I stayed until 11. She wore a blue muslin— What is that?" I had betrayed myself by a quick movement which sent a glass tumbler crashing to the floor. Helen Zabriskie had worn a blue muslin on that same night. I had noted it when I stood on the balcony watching her and her husband. "That noise?" It was Joe who was speaking. "You don't know Reuben as well as I do, or you wouldn't ask. It is his practice, I am sorry to say, to accentuate his pleasure in draining my bottles by dropping a glass at every third one." Mr. T went on. "She was a married woman, and I thought she loved me. But, and this is the greatest proof I can offer you that I am giving you a true account of that night, she had not had the slightest idea of the extent of my passion, and only consented to see me at all because she thought, poor thing, that a word from her would set me straight and rid her of attentions that were fast becoming obnoxious. A sorry figure for a fellow to cut who has not been without his triumphs. But you caught me on the most detestable date in my calendar, and—" There is where he stopped being interesting, so I will not waste time by quoting further. And now what reply shall I make when Joe Smithers asks me double his usual price, as he will be sure to do next time? Has he not earned an advance? I really think so. I have spent the whole day in weaving together the facts I have gleaned, and the suspicions I have formed, into a consecutive whole, likely to present my theory in a favorable light to my superiors. But just as I thought myself in shape to meet their inquiries, I received an immediate summons into their presence, where I was given a duty to perform of so extraordinary and unexpected a nature that it effectually drove from my mind all my own plans for the elucidation of the Zabriskie mystery. This was nothing more nor less than to take charge of a party of people who were going to the Jersey Heights for the purpose of testing Dr. Zabriskie's skill with a pistol. End of Chapter 2, Part 2.